Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Postcolonial Ponderings. I am Eli, and I will be your host for today's episode. Joining us, we've got Abigail, Emmy, Ivania, myself, Eli, Max, and Rachel. Leading today's discussion is Emmy, and she will be talking about a topic that I'm very excited to hear all about. But before we get started, I would like to point you to our introduction podcast in case you missed it, because it will give you a lot of information and context as to some of the stuff we will be discussing. And with that, I will let Emmy take the stage.
Why, hello, friends, family, and professors that are forced to listen to this podcast. Let's get started. So, my question, based on postcolonialism and the books we've read in this class, is kind of a threefold question. It's connected to lots of other questions. But basically, I'm asking, what does it mean to be a postcolonial author and write in English, or to translate their work into English? And should postcolonial authors write in English or their native languages? And does writing in English contribute to the subaltern's inability to speak? So we are tackling some big nerdy English questions here. We'll be talking all about translation and language. So I suggest you buckle up and get ready for a lot of word and name dropping. So first I want to talk about Spivak, who was an amazing postcolonial theorist. We talked about her a little bit in our class together, and the gist, she's not one of my main sources, so I'm just going to go over her and not give her nearly enough justice, but we're crunched on time. Spivak basically says that the subaltern or the colonized in this sense can't really speak for themselves for a majority of reasons, because they are often quieted, like how Ivania talked in her podcast, which if you haven't even checked it out, you should go give it a look. Also, the fact that if they do speak, they can't be necessarily understood by outsiders, mainly like Western whites who wouldn't know much about their culture and wouldn't have much context. And I'm framing my question today a little bit around Spivak, and I was doing my research. I was trying to dive in to see if translation and the fact that a lot of the postcolonial pieces of literature we've read, all of the ones we've read, but in general, my research also proved that a lot of postcolonial literature is also written in English, which seems a little bit paradoxical because we're trying to study cultures and languages and peoples from all over the world that don't speak English, and to be reading their stories in English seems a little problematic in itself. And I want to see if Spivak would say that translation is a way of silencing the subaltern. So that's good for introduction. Let's get started. My first source was Postcolonial World Literature, Narration, Translation, and Imagination. It's a scholarly article by several authors. If you'd like to see any of the authors and articles, I'll have my bibliography attached. In this piece, the authors argue that translation is not necessarily as bad as people make it out to be. We tend to think of translation as taking one text and changing it and putting it in a new language. So very old to new, one language to the next, a very transactional process. But the authors in this article argue that there is no purely autarkic language. Autarkic is a weird word, which I was forced to look up, but it basically means self-sufficient. So they argue that language in itself, whether it be English or really any other language, they are all contaminated per se. They all have bits and pieces of other languages in them. For example, a lot of our English words today have lots of Latin roots in them. We're not Latin. Our English is not pure, if you want to call it like that. I'm putting air quotes because we're not really talking about pureness of language. But basically, they argue that language is already a mixture of different languages. So it's not a dichotomous process that we think it is from one language to the next, because the language you're translating into is made of several different languages and roots and fun things. And the language you're translating from is also not pure. It's also affected by other languages. I like this quote from the article. It says, importantly, however, it is only in relation to the chimerical idea of some unlimited transparency of language to itself, and hence some perfect translatability within and between languages, that translation is seen as necessary failure and the notion of the untranslatable comes to the fore. Very weird English way to say that it's only when we think of languages as their own like exclusive spheres that translation can be perfectly done at all. Because if languages are already like a mixture of several different cultures and terms, then there's simply no way you can translate all that into another language. So perfect translatability is really not a attainable thing, which is something that's hard for us to understand. And then Apter, which Emily Apter, she's a great theorist on the headlines of translation and literature, and world literature actually. She says that the untranslatable should not be misconceived as pure difference in opposition to the always translatable. Neither the one nor the other occurs in language or literature. So her kind of drastic claim is that nothing is fully translatable, but also nothing is fully untranslatable. So it's just this gray area that we have to exist in, which we tend to like to compartmentalize and make things black and white, but language is tricky. And Apter argues that it will always be tricky and there's no way for it not to be. They basically also go on in this article to say that translation will never be perfect, like I was saying, and it will always miss the mark, and that we can't expect it to be perfect. But that doesn't mean that we should just like throw in the towel and make like shoddy translations. We still need to be very specific about how we translate. I could have plenty more to say on that article, but for the sake of time, we'll move on to my next source. This one is Postcolonial Translation, Theory and Practice. The main author is Susan Bassnett. And this was a really interesting article because it was looking at postcolonialism and translation, not necessarily like together, but in parallel. So she argues that some may think of translation as a metaphor for postcolonial literature, because postcolonial literature is at its root an attempt to translate culture and experience. So this article is kind of wild because it was basically saying that all postcolonial literature, no matter the language it's written in, is a translation in itself of culture. So the two are not so incompatible or as distant as we might think. Yeah, I also want to move on to the next bit. We went into a little bit about just translation as a whole there, but there are different things that people have to say about the ethics of translation, and many scholars differ on where they think the balance is and if translation is good or bad. It's not something that's necessarily agreed upon. People can't really decide, which I was finding out. Let me rifle through my notes here. All right, so I looked into an article called The Politics of Translation in African Postcolonial Literature. And this article had more negative or pessimistic views of translation. And it kind of stressed being faithful to the work that you're translating. One of the quotes here from Daniel Kunune is, "You have constantly to ask yourself whether your translation does justice to the original, whether in fact it says what the author intended to convey. Then, on the other hand, you have to make sure you do not then travesty the idiom of the receiving language." So you have to not only, when you're translating, try and translate what the original text is saying, you also have to make sure that it's understandable in the receiving text, is what we like to call it, the text you're translating to. So for example, if we're translating a piece of Gikuyu literature into English, you have to be sensible about making sure you're saying honest to the Gikuyu culture and what the book was originally saying, but you also have to make sure that it's understandable to English readers once you translate it, and doesn't use obscure and technical terms that no one will understand. So it's a very interesting two-way street. Here they also argued that they said it was obvious that an African language can be best interpreted by an African scholar writing in his own language, and that if you have an African text written by an African author, that the really only suitable people to add on to that text would also have to be African authors, which is interesting because I think that's another thing, that a lot of translations are made by like English speaking people. And that was just another interesting thing. I also don't think I'll have time to get to it, but there's this very interesting poem by a linguist who, in the poem, which basically just talks about African culture and being colonized by the English. The author, the poet, kind of laments having their language and their culture described by English words, which he calls less pregnant than our own, and words berefit of native wit. So it's kind of playing at the fact that the English language really just doesn't do justice to his culture, which is really interesting. But there is more to the story. So there's some pessimistic ideas. Emily Apter herself is generally a little pessimistic. I read her book Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, and by read I mean skimmed the introduction, and it was quite dense. But what I can tell is that Apter, who is, like I said, this world language and like world literature theorist on translation, she is afraid that the movement of world literature, or this like circulation of books from around the world, is going too fast, and that there's not enough discretion and care used when circulating, discussing, and translating the texts. She thinks that we've kind of gotten this like wind of, we want to know more about other cultures, we want to get these books out there, we want to circulate them, we want to have world literature as its own study. And she doesn't think that's bad. She just thinks that people are going about it too fast, and that in doing so, we're prone to cutting corners, trying to establish the canon of world literature. She puts it like this: she believes studies in world literature fall prey inevitably to the tendency to zoom over the speed bumps of untranslatability in the rush to cover ground. I think it was very interesting that she used the metaphor of speed bumps for untranslatability. It implies that untranslatability is like a hiccup in the road of translation, but not a full stop. Like if you reach something and you're like, oh, this is not translatable in my language, that implying that it's a speed bump means that we need to stop, reassess, and figure out how to move forward in the best possible way, but not to stop completely. So I think she's arguing for a more balanced system of reading and translating and just taking time. She says that in a counter move, I invoke untranslatability as a deflationary gesture towards the expansion of gargantuan scale of world literary endeavors, which is basically what I just said. She thinks that these speed bumps and taking a stop here is her counter move to the widespread of world literature, and her fear that it's gaining a lot of ground too fast and cutting corners along the way. Now, I want to, we've gone over about the theory and that kind of stuff, but I wanted to go over some specific post-colonial authors and their thoughts on translation. The whole reason that I actually picked up this topic in the first place was the intro to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's River Between. The intro by the publisher or the editor stated that after that book, which I believe was his first book, he began to write only in Gikuyu, his native language, instead of English, like he had read how he had written The River Between in. And I thought that was very interesting, which is why this sparked this whole idea, because I wanted to know why did Thiong'o decide that he needed to write in Gikuyu, and how that affect his readership and things like that. So I looked a little bit into this article called Postcolonial Worlds in Translation, again by Susan Bassnett. She is also a forerunner on this front. And she mentioned Thiongo in her book, and she actually had some cool quotes from him too. He says that he's lived his entire life in translation because Thiongo attended an English language school where he was rewarded for speaking in English and punished for speaking in Gikuyu, which is interesting. And this article says that he eventually chose to write all his books in Gikuyu as a way of speaking against this idea that English was better than Gikuyu, which he was raised with when he was going to the English school. But then after some years, he realized that his works still needed to be translated in order to reach a more diverse group of readers, because he had to realize that, yes, it's a political statement and a social statement to not write my books in English, which is like a very dominant language. But in doing that, he also lost a very large readership, because if he didn't write English then, and if he didn't let his books be translated into English, then there's no way that people in England and the Americas could read it unless they were fluent in Gikuyu. So then he eventually relinquished, and he let his books be translated into English. In the article, it says that he learned to write in both English and Gikuyu and ended up creating his own, what they called continuous dialogue, which includes both languages. So he kind of came to reckon the two together, and he learned to embrace both as part of his identity. He translates his own words back and forth when he writes. He writes in Gikuyu, translates it to English, translates it back to Gikuyu, trying to add and make sure his experience is authenticated in what he's writing. Here's a quote from him. Quite often, I find myself having to translate a draft I had thought was complete, only to find, in the process of translation, that the original was inadequate. The muse would possess me again, and I would go to the Gikuyu original, write more drafts, which I later subjected to yet another translation into English. So basically, what I was just saying, he keeps going back and forth, trying to find like the perfect center, the perfect mean. When postcolonial literature studies first came to the forefront in the 1980s, people were very like focused on the hegemony, or like the difference between like the English language and how it was like the dominating language. But now the common thought, the common opinion is that languages can coexist and linguistic hybridity is possible. We see it all around the world. We see it here at Fox. People speak both in Spanish and English, and we can coexist and communicate with each other and learn from each other in this setting without necessarily having to translate and change their stuff by translating. It reminded me of how at Fox, at worship chapels, occasionally they go from singing in English to singing in Spanish, and how it's just this beautiful like blend of cultures and letting there be room for both. And I also saw this idea of linguistic hybridity in The River Between a little bit. It was kind of implied, because it's not, translation is more about the making of these books and less about the books in general, and less about their characters. So it was kind of hard to draw upon any characters. But Wayaki, the main character in The River Between, Thiongo's book, his native language is Gikuyu, but he also goes to an English school to learn the ways of the white man. So we can also assume that he speaks English as well. And he seems to be able to balance these, which kind of supports the idea that we can have both, and they can both hold separate places. I'm going to wrap up as quickly as I can. I have a couple more authors who had things to say about translations. Here I have an article on translating the Indian past, the poet's experience. So this focused on some Indian poets and how they feel about translation. And a quote from this says that poetry is really about like capturing the essence, and so is translation. And the quote goes, after saying that it's about capturing the essence, yet anything goes will not do. The translation must not only represent, but represent the original. One walks a tightrope between the to language and the from language and double loyalty. A translator is an artist on oath. So this article really stressed the idea that it's about both the to language or the beginning language and the from language and how they come together, and that it's not necessarily, the point of translation is not necessarily to translate word for word, it's to capture the essence, and that we only start to see translation as a failure when we assume that we need to translate perfectly, that we can translate perfectly, or that that's the point of translation in the first place. Translation is just a delicate but not impossible process. And another quote from this same article is, sometimes one may only succeed in representing a poem, not in closely representing it. And that there's just, they refer to this act of translation as like walking a tightrope. And then they actually added a very interesting sort of parable / metaphor about translation, which I thought was interesting to add, so I'll read it now. A Chinese emperor ordered a tunnel to be bored through a great mountain. The engineers decided that the best and quickest way to do it would be to begin work on both sides of the mountain after precise measurements. If the measurements are precise enough, the two tunnels will meet in the middle, making a single one. But what happens if they don't meet? Asked the emperor. The counselors, in their wisdom, answered, if they don't meet, we will have two tunnels instead of one. So the way I took to mean this is that the goal of translation is to get the original work and the translated work to line up, like the tunnels. Like you're going from opposite sides, opposite cultures, opposite worlds, and your goal is for them to line up. But if they somehow miss each other, there is still, if the translation is not harmful and completely false and makes the whole mess of the image of the other people, if that's not the case, then you can have two interesting revelations that are similar but not the same, and that translation in itself is an art. So I thought it was really interesting. And then the last author that I got to look into was Salman Rushdie, who is an Indian American author. And he had a very similar experience to Ngugi Thiong'o in the sense that he also refers to himself as a translated man. So these authors like refer to themselves as translated, which I thought was really interesting, because he moved across the world from India to Pakistan to England and then to America. And he kind of refers to, or in this article I was reading about him, it refers to translation as a migratory event, which would have some really interesting implications, I think, if we think about Australia's colonial history and identity, and about like if they were translated when they moved. So yeah, for the sake of time, I could talk again for years about this, but I will open it up to questions. That's all I got for now.
Question. I had a question. Oh, never mind.
Yeah,
Eli, you go first.
Okay. That was great. Saw that.
Sorry, guys.
There's a lot of, so much to talk about with that, and a lot of really interesting perspectives. Some of the stuff that you're talking about earlier on from the first article really got me thinking about just like the limitations of like language in general, and how even within one language, two people can speak the exact same language and still have different ideas of what certain words or phrases like mean. And so like there's possibilities for things to get lost in translation, even when they aren't being translated. And that just got me thinking about like within just like a single language like English, or maybe looking back at older texts, like looking back at like Shakespeare or like the New King James Bible. Do you think that there's any anything from your research that we should also be keeping in mind when we look at these older texts that maybe aren't as digestible to modern English speakers when we read them, and like is on some level, like even looking at like Shakespeare's sonnets, like it takes some like translation to kind of break down what exactly is being said in each thing. Do you think there's something that when we do that, it's kind of a similar process?
Yeah, I really do think it's a similar process. I think our basic idea of translation is always like translating one literary work from the next, but I think we all participate in translation like every day. Like you can talk in slang to one person and someone's like, oh, what did you mean by saying that? Like my mom, I have to translate for my mom every day. I'm like, LOL mom. And she's like, what does LOL mean? And I have to translate. So I think translation is more often used than not. And I think what you were saying about the like King James version of the Bible and Shakespeare would be a really interesting vein of translation to look into. I don't feel like I can speak much to those specific texts because I was looking into most post-colonial texts. But I do think it would be interesting to see how those versions were translated in the first place, like what was before the King James, go back to that and just go down the line of like different Bible versions and to see the translations going into each other and what they take from each other and what they leave behind. I think that'd be really interesting. That's a really good thought. Eli?
If I can speak and ask my question, earlier you were talking about the articles you read on the idea of translation and how translation was looked at in a negative light because the authors or the translators or the speakers of the original language didn't think that it was being translated correctly or it wasn't being like things were getting lost or being misspoken, and how they were looking down on translation. But that makes me beg the question, what's the solution to people who don't speak that language natively? Because even if we don't translate it and we learn the language ourselves to read the works that we want to otherwise have translated, that's still being translated by us having to learn a different language. We're just translating it in our head then, instead of being on the page, having someone else translate it for us. And so is there any true way for us to experience these works of literature in their native tongue if we're not native speakers of that language?
I don't think so. I think the answer for people who would not want to translate their works into English would be, in fact, to leave us as an audience behind. I think that is the only way that they could stay entirely true, or at least mostly true to what they're saying, and like without any translation. But most authors like Thiongo decided that that wasn't what he wanted to do. That wasn't the purpose of his writing. I believe Thiongo is writing both for himself and for his people, but also for us, so we could learn more, because part of the whole reason to share your story is to educate others on it. And I think that's one of the whole points of literature itself and the study of literature. So I think you're right. There's really no way for us to truly and authentically experience these books that we've been reading. But I do think that with the right translations, with the speed bumps, with us knowing that it is translated and that we're not going to understand all of it, but we can understand some, I think that's the position we're supposed to hold as readers.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I don't think we really have a ton of time for like me to ask another question. But I did just want to point out, and I wanted to say that I really appreciate you going into this topic. I think it's really interesting, and the way you approached it is awesome. Yeah, it's really interesting to me because it's like I was reading a book, Dante's Inferno, and it's like it's been translated from Italian, and guess what, like it has a different like rhyme scheme, and if you like knew about this, you can like read it this different way in its native language. But in English, that's like just not necessarily, it's just not, we can't do it. But anyways, I just wanted to, yeah, I really liked it and really awesome, but I think we're kind of out of time, so.
Thank you. I know I kind of got carried away. I had like 7 pages of notes and I was just going, quoting.
Hey, well, yeah, no, you could talk about it for hours, but.
I could.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And I'd love to learn even more about this topic some other time, because I was just seems like there's so much material on it, which is really great. So that kind of does it though for today's episode. So again, Emmy, thank you so much for all your explanations and the research that you did. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in on today's podcast. And yeah, if what we talked about today has piqued your interest, be sure to check out our other podcasts and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Chowder, everybody.